Hey, my friend, I'm Dr. Lee Warren, and I am so grateful to be back with you for another episode of the Self Brain Surgery Podcast. I've been trying to get today's guest on the show for over 2 years. Dr. Stephen Meyer is a world renowned scientist. He's one of the founders of a branch of science called intelligent design. He received a PhD in philosophy from the University of Cambridge. And before he was a philosopher of science, he was a geophysicist. So Stephen Meyer is a pretty smart guy. He is in high demand as a public speaker. He goes all over the world for scientific conferences, public speaking. He was on Joe Rogan last year. He's written a number of books, and I've been reading him for years. And the reason that I wanted to bring Stephen to you is because he can help us get at this question that we all want to know. Is there any reason or meaning or purpose behind us being here? And if we're all just a bunch of neurons and cells that are firing and everything about you and your life and your experience of life, and even backing up from that, if every bit of why we're even here was just some sort of stack of accidents that happened after an original accident where nothing became everything, if that's all true, then there really is no purpose and no point to your life. And so this philosophy that's so prevalent in neuroscience and all over science in general, and even in the world at large, called materialism, is this idea that we're all just the stuff that we're made of, and that everything we can study and know really needs to just ask the question of what are we made out of and how does that stuff behave? And if you can reduce it down to its component parts, then you can determine how its life is going to be, even you. And so I found after losing a son that was hollow. It didn't have any purpose behind it. And Viktor Frankl said, as we'll talk about later, the concentration camp survivor from World War II, was also a psychiatrist, and he wrote one of the world's most famous books, Man's Search for Meaning. He said, basically, if you can find a way to give something purpose or meaning, it stops to feel like suffering. It no longer feels like suffering. And that's what I found after we lost Mitch. I had big questions like, does my faith really mean anything? Do I really have hope that there's a resurrection, that I get to see my son again? And what is the science that I so hold dear and that I work in every day have to say about all that? And running into the philosophy of materialism and neuroscience, we're all just the product of our brain activity, that didn't offer any hope. And yet my faith offered hope that there were real answers to these questions. And so I started reading, and I've been reading very widely, as we talk about all the time on this show for the last 12 years now. And I've learned a lot about how the mind and the brain work, more than I thought I knew as a neurosurgeon even, more than I knew as a professional bench researcher back when I used to work in the immunology labs with John Hurley at the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation. I did some bench work in immunology that led to some papers in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and the Lancet. And we got some big grants, and we did some good work in lupus and ankylosing spondylitis, and all of that information and knowledge that I had in science couldn't help me feel better after I lost a son. And so where do you turn when there's big questions? Well, that's why we're going to have a conversation today with Stephen Meyer. Stephen has, like I said, he's a philosopher of science, a PhD from Cambridge. He is a geophysicist before that. And now he's the director of the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. He's written 3 incredible books, the Return of the God Hypothesis, which I reviewed back in 23 and told you it was one of the best books I've ever read, and will really change your mind about what science is and how there is this supposed rift between science and faith that's never actually been there. That Return of the God Hypothesis, I think, is one of the most well-written and broadly intelligent look at that question. And Stephen Meyer has been interviewed by people like Lee Strobel, who we've had on the show a couple of times for his book, Is God Real? And some of his other work. Stephen Meyer is the guy that people call when they have a question about science and how science and faith interact. He was a New York Times bestseller with his book, Darwin's Doubt. He had another book before that called Signature in the Cell that's all about information processing and how information shows up in DNA in a way that simply can't be explained without there being some sort of intelligent designer. And so Stephen has walked the walk and talked the talk of really trying to synthesize what can be measured and tested and known about science and what the reasonable conclusions are among those things. And the most reasonable conclusion being then that there has to be some intelligence involved in all this. So we're going to have a really deep conversation with Stephen Meyer today. You're going to hear some stuff that goes way deep over my head, even as a brain surgeon and a scientist. Stephen is a brilliant man, and he loves the Lord, but he also loves science. And he didn't start out intelligent design by trying to integrate his faith in his science. What he did was he was a really, really good scientist who, looking at the evidence, could not explain the things he was seeing without there being some sort of underlying intelligence in it. And so Stephen wasn't trying to pick a fight with the Darwinists when he wrote Signature in the Cell. He wasn't trying to pick a fight with evolution. He was just trying to be a good scientist and follow the evidence where it led. And that led him to intelligent design. So we're going to talk today about the world's leading authority on intelligent design, about big questions and big answers, and how we can find hope when we're disoriented by the meaninglessness and the lack of landmarks in our lives. And I'll have to tell you a little personal story. I was reading one of his books, Darwin's Doubt, and it's this long book, beautiful, wonderful, deep science book about fossils and Cambrian explosions and all these transitional forms and all this paleontology and fossil records and talking about Darwin and all this stuff. And I was blown away that I got to a page and was stopped dead in my tracks by a story that was so poignant that it actually made me shed a tear. I wasn't expecting it. In the middle of this, frankly, nerdy scientific conversation about the Burgess Shale in Canada and fossil records, I was taken aback by this beautiful bit of writing that Stephen did. And I can't wait to introduce you to my new friend, Dr. Stephen Meyer. Stephen Meyer, one of the world's leading experts on intelligent design, philosopher of science, written 3 books that I hold very dear to my heart, have helped me make a lot of sense of science and faith. Welcome to the show, Steve. Thank you for your time.
It's good to be with you, Doctor.
Yeah, it's good. Call me Lee, please. And just want to have a conversation about...
You're in your scrubs. I'm reverting to patient mode here.
I know, right? We're not going to do any real brain surgery today, but no, I'm at work. For the listener who doesn't recognize the background here, I'm normally in a very controlled studio environment. Today I'm at the office, and Stephen and I have a chance to sit down and talk. We'll take that chance. It's hard to get both of us on the same schedule here. So appreciate your time, Stephen. You're a very busy guy, and you go all over the world defending the faith and tying science and faith together. But I think just for the listener who doesn't know your story yet, maybe give us just a high-level overview of your career and your life and what got you to writing books about Darwin and the history of science and how that comes together with faith.
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in what you might call the big questions, especially those that intersect science and philosophy or science and theology. And I had kind of a long, protracted conversion experience where I was anything but Damascus Road. I was kind of thinking about all these things for a long period of time. And in my mid-20s, started to really settle. And about that time, I attended a conference where there was leading scientists and philosophers discussing the big questions, the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the nature and origin of human consciousness. And the conference was divided along those 3 main subjects. And each panel discussing them was divided between those scientists who were theists and those that were agnostic or materialists. I was surprised and impressed that it seemed like the theists had the intellectual initiative in each of these conversations. And I became fascinated in particular with the question of the origin of the universe and the origin of life. A year later, I was off to grad school in Cambridge, England. I ended up doing my master's thesis and then PhD thesis on origin of life biology. I was particularly intrigued with the whole question of the origin of the information inside living systems, the information encoded in the DNA molecule, and the challenge that was posing to all materialistic, chemical, evolutionary theories of the origin of life, and was also intrigued with the possibility that in looking at or in observing information as a primary feature of living systems, that we were actually looking at an evidence of a designing mind, a designing intelligence in the history of life. That was in the background of a lot of my thinking while I was finishing my PhD. And it took me an embarrassingly long number of years to finally produce a book on that. The first book that I wrote on the theory of intelligent design was called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Case for Intelligent Design. That came out in 2009. And then I've had a couple of books in sequels since. The first, Darwin's Doubt, in 2013, showing that the problem of the origin of biological information is not just a problem at the point of the origin of the first life, but it recurs at multiple points throughout the history of life as you get these large explosions of new fossil form appearing in the fossil record, new animal form appearing in the fossil record. Every time we get new biological form, scientists recognize we need information to build that new form, And those new infusions of information into the biosphere, I argue, provide evidence of intelligent design. And then my most recent book is kind of addressing the question of the identity of the designer. Lots of my readers wanted to know after the first two books, well, who do you think the designing intelligence is that's responsible for life, and what can science tell us about that question? And so I, in a sense, expanded the range of phenomena that I was addressing in the most recent book, looking at evidence of design in physics and in cosmology, suggesting that when we bring those additional classes of evidence into this story, that you've got a powerful case for basic theism, that the designing intelligence responsible for life and the universe could not be a space alien, but rather it must be an agent which transcends the physical universe, is capable of structuring and designing the universe as a whole, and is also active in the creation, as we see these big infusions of information at different points along the timeline of cosmic history. That's been kind of one of the ways I've addressed this whole question of the relationship between science and belief in God, theistic belief, and that is to argue that the scientific evidence is not neutral with respect to competing worldviews. It's not hostile to theism, but rather it's actually supportive of a theistic worldview.
That's right. I mean, just for the listener who may not realize this, but one of the things that you talk about in the return of the God hypothesis is this idea in popular society that science and faith or science has kind of replaces the need for faith, or replaces or eliminates the need for God. And science has always been about asking questions and answers without invoking God. The truth is, organized science sort of started from a place of trying to explain what God did, didn't it?
Yeah, well, it started in a decidedly Christian milieu, and for decidedly, I would say, Judeo-Christian reasons. Both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and especially some of the focus of late medieval and subsequent Western theology, brought back into focus the dependence of science on something like the doctrine of creation. That you have, when we talk about science, bringing science and faith into alignment, many people don't realize how much faith there is at the foundation of science. Scientists presuppose the intelligibility of nature, that there's a pattern there that can be discerned by the human intellect, and that the human intellect is a reliable instrument for discerning the pattern, the design, the lawful order that we now perceive in nature. Well, this was a decidedly biblical assumption, that because we were made in the image of God, and we had, as part of that endowment, the capacity of rationality, the ability to understand the creation, the design that God placed in nature. And so there was a principle of correspondence, that the God who made who made and designed the orderly natural world, made our minds in such a way that we could understand the natural world. And that meant that assumptions that the philosophers pointed out that all human agents invoke as they're trying to understand the world around them are actually assumptions that we can trust. Our minds look at the world as if we knew it had an underlying order. This is the so-called assumption of the uniformity of nature. Well, that assumption makes sense if you believe that our minds were made as reliable instruments to know the world around us. And so many of the assumptions that make science possible came directly out of a Judeo-Christian worldview, and the whole impulse to study nature was inspired by a desire to study the acts of the Creator. And this was a decidedly Christian idea in the period of late medieval Catholic theology, and during the period of the Reformation, in the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, that corresponds to that period that historians call the Scientific Revolution. Strong theological motivation for science, and a strong theological justification for the reliability of the mind that made science possible. And those were decidedly, again, theological.
That's right. So what's the genesis then of this, I would say, myth that science is an enemy to faith? Like, where did the idea that Newton, who was decidedly Christian, was the father of this sort of materialistic worldview? How did that come about? How did we get?
Well, this is some late 19th century revisionist historiography. Books like The Warfare Between Science and Christianity, or the conflict model that arose during that period of time. And it was largely an artifact of the tension that people were perceiving between Darwinian theory and biblical theology. And people writing about the history of science then wrote that kind of perceived tension back into the history of science in its entirety. And it's a misreading of that history. It's a grotesque misreading of that history. Talk about the genesis of an idea. There's an article I read during my PhD years called the Genesis of the Concept of the Laws of Nature by a historian called Edward Zilsel, fairly obscure figure, but a very interesting piece of work that was published in the 1940s, which he went back and showed that the concept of laws of nature, one of the key metaphors that was a kind of guidepost or inspiration for science, that there were these law-like patterns in nature, that he said this was a juridical metaphor of theological origin. And he traces it back to the Hebrew Bible, shows that you get this concept not from Greco-Roman ideas, but rather from places like the book of Job and the book of Jeremiah in the Hebrew Bible. So there's the genesis of key ideas that made science possible really came out of the Hebrew Bible and the reformers and the late medieval Catholic theologians rediscovering that doctrine of biblical creation and then treating the creation as an orderly system made by a divine intellect who also made our minds capable in a way that allowed us to understand the order and design that he placed in the world.
That's right. Now, when we talk about Darwin, so I think everybody that goes to school in the United States, in public school anyway, is kind of given this assumption that Darwinism as a worldview is the true way to look at how we got here and how we've changed over time. So maybe address just for a second for the uninitiated what we mean when we say Darwinism versus neo-Darwinism and what Darwin actually had to say about origin of life, which is very little, and what happened since then.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that question. Maybe I'll break it into parts. The term evolution is what we maybe as a touch point in the discussion, and it can mean many different things, and it can therefore be quite confusing. It can mean simply change over time, or it can mean small scale change over time, such as the change we observe in the shape and size of finch beaks of the Galapagos finches. That sometimes we call microevolution. The term evolution can also mean continuous, unbroken change over time. And this was the idea, and this corresponds to the idea of universal common ancestry or universal common descent. And this was a key part of Darwin's original theory, not just that things had changed, but they'd changed dramatically and continuously, such that the best way to depict the history of life is as a great branching tree where all the forms of life that exist today represent the ends of the branches, and the trunk of the tree represents the first one-celled organism, or maybe one or very few one-celled organisms from which all the other forms of life that have ever existed morphed and changed. So this is a really kind of radical view of the extent of change possible. It's continuous and quite extensive. And then the third meaning of evolution is the idea that the change that has occurred has been unguided and undirected. There hasn't been a guiding hand behind it. It's not theistic evolution. It's not deistic evolution. It's completely undirected and unguided. And it's undirected and unguided in the Darwinian view of things because there is a mechanism, namely natural selection, acting on random variations, and that we would now say mutations, that generates that continuous biological change over long periods of time. And so the whole idea of natural selection was that it was a kind of designer's substitute. This mechanism, this unguided, undirected mechanism could mimic the powers of a designing intelligence without itself being guided or directed in any way. And so now if we bring in the idea of Darwinism affirms all three of those meanings of evolution: change over time, continuous, unbroken change over time, and an undirected mechanism that can produce that extensive and continuous change. Modern neo-Darwinism is, since it's really not that modern anymore, but from the 1930s to the 1960s, there was a new form of Darwinian thinking that incorporated the idea of mutations as being the key type of variation upon which natural selection acts, and therefore that becomes the driving engine of biological change in the neo-Darwinian scheme of things. That's the textbook version of Darwinism that we mostly learned in high school or college. And the big news flash there is that theory of biological origins has been under acute pressure within even the field of evolutionary biology itself from at least the late 1970s right up to the present. And I think more and more you find that people working in biology, even people working in evolutionary biology, are looking for a new theory of evolution. I and a number of my colleagues attended a conference in 2016 at the Royal Society in London, arguably the most august scientific body in the world, and a whole group of evolutionary biologists had convened the conference to discuss the current status of neo-Darwinism and, in fact, the need for a new theory of evolution. And the main reason for that is that the mechanism of mutation and natural selection is seen to lack creative power. It does a nice job of explaining small-scale change, like the finch beaks getting bigger and smaller in response to varying weather patterns, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining the origin of new forms of life, fundamentally new forms of life, what's called morphological innovation in the history of life, as documented by new forms of animal life and other life arising abruptly in the fossil record. So right now there's a kind of crisis, I think, in evolutionary biology. People are talking about a third way. Which means they're not for intelligent design or neo-Darwinism, and there's been a proliferation of new theories of evolution, but most of them, in fact, I would argue all of them, have the same problem. They lack a mechanism with the creative power to generate the large-scale change that we see arising in the history of life.
That's right. So when you talk about, well, let's go back to signature and cell for a minute. I mean, you talk about information in DNA, and that giving you this idea that somebody signed his work, basically, like that you're looking at the evidence in information in DNA as sort of an unexplainable feature if there wasn't some design. That's what led you to the idea of intelligent design. So unpack that intelligent design.
Right. And you're right. I didn't really answer the whole of your previous question, but it was too long of an answer anyway.
Too long of a question. Yeah.
But many people don't realize that Darwin didn't really address the question of the origin of the first life.
That's
At
right.
the base of that Darwinian tree of life was always just in the way it was depicted. He was depicting a first primordial organism, a kind of simple cell. But he never explained where that cell came from. And so the question of how you get life from non-life, which is in a sense perhaps the most profound question of all, was never seriously addressed by Darwin. He alluded to a possible approach to answering the question in a very short letter in response to a question about this from a friend, Joseph Hooker. This is his famous warm little pond speculation. But he never developed anything like a detailed theory of the chemical evolutionary origin of the first life, how you get from this simple chemicals in sort of some kind of prebiotic environment to the first actual functioning, self-replicating cellular organism. So no details there from Darwin. And there were theories about the origin of life formulated in more detailed theories formulated in the 1930s, 50s, up to the 1960s. And then something really significant happened that I think just put the brakes on the whole attempt to explain the origin of the first life from a strictly chemical and materialistic point of view. There have been people continuing to try to explain it, but with no success. And what put the brakes on, what created the impasse in the field, was the discoveries in the 90s that historians of science now call the molecular biological revolution. This started with people like Sanger working on proteins, and especially people like Watson and Crick, who elucidated the structure of the DNA molecule in 1953. And then in 1957, 1958, Francis Crick, who had been interestingly a code breaker in World War II, realizes that the chemical subunits that run along the spine of that famed double helix structure are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or like the zeros and ones in a section of software, which is to say it's not the physical properties of the subunits. They're called nucleotide bases. that give them their function. It's their arrangement, their specific arrangement in accord with an independent symbol convention that we now call the genetic code, which was later discovered. And so in 1958, we get this so-called sequence hypothesis that forces people to recognize that DNA is not just a chemical, a large bio-macromolecule, it's a carrier of information. The physicist George Gamow characterized it as something like a digital bit string. And so you've got this digital information that is crucial to building all the proteins and protein machines that cells need to stay alive. But it raises a huge question. Where does that information come from? And we've had, since the 1960s, as this question sort of settled into the collective mind of origin of life researchers, we've had multiple different attempts to explain that. And by, I think, almost acclamation, a universal consensus, there's been no satisfactory chemical evolutionary explanation for the origin of life or the origin of information necessary to build it. And yet, and this is where the whole case for intelligent design comes in, we do know of a cause from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, that is capable of producing information. And that cause is intelligence. Whenever we see information, whether it's in the form of a digital bit string or computer code or a section of text in a literary work or in a hieroglyphic inscription, that information, if you trace it back to its ultimate source, always comes from a mind, not an undirected material process. So I've argued in Signature in the Cell and subsequent books that the information that arises with the first life is a powerful indicator of the activity of a designing intelligence in the origin of life. And that's the genesis of the book title, Signature in the Cell.
That's right. And you weren't, at least from my reading, you weren't trying to pick a fight with Darwin or the Darwinian evolutionists when you wrote that book. You were just trying to suggest that there's information in the cell, and that information points to, by all reasonable tests, the possible explanation being that there's a designer.
Yeah, and the presence of specified or functional information in DNA, in RNA, and proteins is not a controversial fact of biology. Leroy Hood, our famed biotech expert out here in Seattle, simply says DNA contains digital code. Bill Gates says it's like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever written. And even Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that the gene code is uncannily computer-like. He says it's like a machine code. So this is not a controversial. The basis of my argument is not controversial. The argument itself may be controversial, but what I argue is that when we look at the different attempts that have been made to explain the origin of that digital, biological, genetic information in even the simplest cells, we find that none of the proposed materialistic mechanisms or processes are sufficient. None of them have demonstrated the power to produce information. It turns out to be very difficult to get from chemistry alone to code without a directing intelligence. And again, yet we know that code and information always arises from a mind. So that's the argument. And no, I wasn't trying to pick a fight with the Darwinians, because Darwin never addressed, as I mentioned, the origin of the first life. I was challenging chemical evolutionary theories, but not biological evolutionary theories. But nevertheless, some of the people who attacked the first book, Signature in the Cell, most vigorously, attacked it on the basis of a kind of Darwinian perspective, arguing that they posed as counter arguments the alleged creative power of mutation and selection to create new information from pre-existing information, totally bypassing the actual argument of the book, which is that the origin of information in the first cell, in the very first place, is unexplained by chemical evolutionary processes. To counter that, they invoked biological evolutionary processes, which rather missed the whole point of the argument. But having made that argument, and having made that counter argument to me and made it poorly, eventually I thought, I'm not going to let these guys get away with this. It turns out that the information problem recurs when you're trying to explain the origin of new forms of animal life, for example, especially in an event which I focused on in the second book called the Cambrian explosion, where you get a massive number of new animal body plans arising very abruptly or discontinuously in the fossil record.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, I'm shocked that you weren't just warmly embraced by the community of evolutionists after that first book. Maybe tell a quick story to the listener about that, because you faced a fair amount of public scrutiny and had to face a fair amount of scientific I don't know what the right word is.
Well, some distress, I suppose, but it's interesting, actually. I published an article 5 years prior to that, back in 2004, in a peer-reviewed biology journal published out of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. It's actually the oldest peer-reviewed biology journal in America, the Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington. And when that article was published, there was a huge furor. The editor who allowed the article to go through peer review and ultimately approved it after I made some revisions at the recommendations of the peer reviewers was viciously persecuted. They couldn't get at me. I was in an independent scientific research institute, the Discovery Institute here in Seattle. And so they punished the editor who allowed the piece to go through review. And he lost his office, his access to scientific samples. He was transferred out of his department and away from a friendly collaborating researcher to an office next door to the Smithsonian's management so they could keep an eye on him. Mm. And then he was denounced by the society that published the journal, and eventually it was told that they couldn't guarantee his personal safety, that tempers were running so high in the museum. And on it went. He had a dual appointment to the National Institutes of Health, a second appointment there, and it took a senator to intervene to save his job. It was just a horrific experience for this gentleman. His name was Richard Sternberg. 2 earned PhDs in biology, dozens of peer-reviewed papers of his own, really a smart scientist. In any case, that was for me the most intense kind of pushback I'd received, and even then it was somewhat indirect. But in 2009, when Signature in the Cell came out, there were some negative reviews, but they were really off point, as I mentioned. Yeah. And there were a number of very positive reviews as well. In fact, the book was eventually nominated and accepted as a book of the year by the London Times Literary Society, and it was nominated for that award by none other than a very famous atheistic philosopher of science named Thomas Nagel, who then himself was abused for having given the book commendation. So there's been some pushback, but I would say now, 15 years on from the publication of that book, and with the entrance into the debate of figures like James Tour, one of the top 40 scientists in the world, a man with over 1,000 peer-reviewed publications in organic chemistry and nanotechnology, I think the debate is shifting decidedly in favor of those who are at least skeptical about these chemical evolutionary theories of the origin of life. And I would say even those who are favorable to the idea that the first cell bears key hallmarks of a designing intelligence, and therefore there's a strong case to be made for intelligent design. James Tour has been writing about the origin of life. He's been, as a chemist, essentially doing a kind of a chemical accounting and showing that these scientists who claim to have simulated something important about some of the steps from simple chemicals to a full-blown living cell are invariably cheating. That they move the chemistry in a life-friendly direction, but only as a result of their own intelligent guidance of the process at every step of the way. And so in doing these so-called simulation experiments, what they're actually simulating is the importance, the need for intelligent design to build systems that have life relevance. And no one has built a cell in the laboratory. That's a massive myth that's still floating around on the internet. We're nowhere close to having humanly designed life, but to the extent we've been able to design molecular structures or nanomachines that have some potential relevance to an actual cell, the building of such structures or information-rich molecules always requires an input of information from intelligent agents, thus simulating intelligent design. The very attempt to simulate life arising through chemical evolution has inadvertently given support to the theory that I've been advocating. A figure like James Tour has been crucial in exposing the cheat.
Wow. We're going to run out of time. I wish we had more time to get into all this even more deeply, but I think most people that have been exposed to Darwinian ideas have this concept that if there's gradual change over time that's led from nothing to us having this conversation, there should be fossils of all of those things out there all along the way. But that's not what we see when we look at the fossil record. So maybe give us a quick understanding of this Cambrian explosion, what it means, and what it might say about the theory.
Right. The most direct evidence, historical evidence that we have of the history of life is that which is preserved in the fossil record. And whereas Darwinism as a theory expects to see or find a picture of continuous gradual change in the morphology or form of organisms over time, what we actually see is not something that looks like a tree, but rather something that looks more like a lawn or perhaps an orchard of separate trees where there is some continuous variability within limits within the major groups, but where the major groups of organisms arise abruptly with no discernible antecedents or precursors in the lower sedimentary strata. And this pattern recurs over and over and over again in the fossil record. A late colleague, Gunter Beckley, a very great German paleontologist, and I wrote a piece together in 2017 about the 19 different such fossil explosions. My book in 2013 focused on what is perhaps the most explosive of all the explosions, which is sometimes called the Cambrian explosion, where you get the major animal body plans first arising in the fossil record in a narrow window of geological time of no more than 10 million years, probably less for the majority of these animal body plans. And this is both a geological and a biological blink of the eye, because when you run calculations as to how much time you would need to generate the amount of change that is documented in the fossil record, 10 million years is way too little time. There's something in mathematical biology called the waiting times problem, where you can calculate the amount of change you would expect to occur in a given amount of time if you know the mutation rate, the time between generations, and the population sizes of the groups you're looking at. And when you run that kind of math on any of the groups that arise in the Cambrian or many other times during the history of life, there's simply not nearly enough time for the Darwinian mechanism to generate the form that arises. And so you have these repeated instances, not just in the Cambrian, but we documented 19 others in the history of life. The first birds, the first winged insects, the first mammals, the first flowering plants. I could go on, the first sea reptiles, the first turtles. You just go on and on. All of these groups appear very abruptly without discernible precursors in the immediately lower strata. And so this just is a pattern that doesn't comport at all with what Darwin expected. And moreover, the attempt to explain the absence of the intermediates has also failed. There's a hypothesis, or a couple different forms of the hypothesis known as the artifact hypothesis, that tries to explain the absence of fossils as a consequence of either incomplete sampling, which is no longer credible after 160 years of looking for the intermediates, or incomplete preservation, which is also no longer credible because there are so many favorable depositional environments that exist in the layers beneath these big explosive events. I write a lot about that in my book, but the point is this pattern is pervasive, it's contra-Darwinian, and it suggests massive increases in the information content of the biosphere at each of these big explosions. And so that information, I argue, provides additional evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence, not just at the point of the origin of life, but all the way through the history of life.
That's right. Well, and I'm just a brain surgeon, so I'm not quite up to speed on all these different disciplines that you so well write about and talk about. But it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that the idea would be that the better tools we develop as scientists to look at things, it would be easier and easier to prove these theories out over time if they were true. So if you take Darwin's theories, the ideas of cosmology, of the neuroscience, of brain generating mind, all those things, it seems like as we got better at looking and developed better instruments to look, we would prove those things more easily if they were true. But what seems to be happening is the more we look into cosmology, the more we look into molecular biology, the more we look into neuroscience with functional
The
imaging.
more we look into physics with the
Right,
discovery of all these fine-tuning parameters and
right.
what's
We see being different than we thought they were going to be, right?
yeah, well, right. And what's I think really curious is that for these great big questions, a strictly materialistic approach to science has not generated any new insight or explanations. How do we explain the origin of the physical material world at a discrete moment in time 13.8 billion years ago, also known as the Big Bang event? Well, for various reasons, and the physics is a big part of this, theoretical physics is suggesting that the origin of the universe is also the point at which matter and energy come into existence. So prior to the origin of matter, or independent of the origin of matter, there's nothing that exists material that exists that can function as a cause. And so you've got this really fundamental problem for scientific materialism, in that it's just causally inadequate to explain the origin of matter, when by the origin of matter we mean the first coming into existence of matter. If we want to think about time before the beginning of the universe, which I understand is problematic, we can say, well, before the beginning of matter, there was no matter to do the causing, or a more nuanced way to put it, because we really can't talk about our time before the beginning of the universe, we could say there's nothing independent of the origin of matter that could cause matter to come in. There's no matter that is known to exist independent of the matter that could cause the matter to come into existence. So you got a big problem for materialism. And the same thing with the fine tuning of the physical parameters that make life possible. Those are set from the very beginning of the universe. And that fine tuning suggests a fine tuner. And yet that means you're looking at evidence for an intelligence that must be capable of shaping the entirety of the universe itself. And so what's happening in this larger debate is it's now the scientific materialists that are really straining at camels and coming up with very bizarre hypotheses, like the idea of the multiverse, or something called quantum cosmology, or the idea that we live in a simulation, or that the information in DNA is, yes, not explained by chemical evolutionary processes on this planet, but life possibly arose on another planet and then was seeded here by an evolved alien. So what's happening is that it's scientific atheism that's getting very weird, that's coming up with these very exotic hypotheses that strain credulity and common sense. And the basic idea of a designing intelligence that's responsible for both the origin and fine-tuning of the universe and the origin of life, because of the features that we find in life in the universe, has much greater parsimony. It explains more evidence more simply and more coherently than any of the alternative materialistic hypotheses, either singly or when conjoined all together into a mashup of weirdness. So I think it's a new day in the whole discussion. Theism is looking very compelling. That's why I call it the return of the God hypothesis. And materialism, I think, is on the defensive, and decidedly so.
If we can do this again someday, if it works out to where we can have another conversation, I want to talk about that book in greater detail. But as we land this plane, Steve, if somebody out there, everybody listening to this show is looking for hope in some way, as I was when I was in my worst moments of my life. And science left me asking questions that science alone couldn't answer. And so you write this story at the end of Darwin's Doubt, or you talk about being up on the mountain with your son, and he gets kind of disoriented because you're in this big open field. And maybe tell that story real quickly, and then tie it to where you know I'm going here is when you're looking for answers in your life and science can't seem to answer them. Is it rational? Is it reasonable? Do you have to check your brain at the door to look for intelligence or to find faith? And maybe help us process that for a moment.
Well, I think the story you're referring to was a story I told at the end of Darwin's Doubt, of a mighty hike we took up to the Burgess Shale in Canada at some considerable altitude, where there have been all these beautiful Cambrian fossils preserved. And my son Jamie was 12 at the time, and he and I were with a group of geophysicists and paleontologists walking across this, getting near the end of the hike, walking across this large talus slope of rock and chunks of the Burgess Shale that were just making this huge steep slope. And there was a kind of narrow path, and it was not too steep to walk, but if you look to the right down the side of the mountain, it was very disorienting. And my son got a kind of vertigo experience because there was nothing to give a sense of perspective or context for where we were. Suddenly it just felt like we were in this vast open space and we could fall into a kind of abyss. And when I was telling this story to our staff writer, David Klinghoffer, he said, that's kind of a metaphor for first century human beings, and that we have all these facts. We have, it was maybe represented in the metaphor by all the chunks of rock all around us, but we don't have any framework for making sense of it. And I think that the biblical worldview is a beautiful framework for making sense, not only the facts of science, but the facts of our experience as moral beings, as spiritual beings, as people looking for meaning. Another favorite book of mine is the great work by the Holocaust surviving psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And in my most recent book, Return to the God Hypothesis, I argue that nothing can mean anything to a rock or to a planet or to even a DNA molecule. Things only mean things to persons. Right. And so if there is to be meaning, there must be personal agents in the universe. Right. And yet we all die. And so if there's to be lasting or enduring meaning, there must be an agent who outlives us all, which is to say, if there is a God, it puts the question of that kind of personal meaning back on the table. Many 20th century, 21st century people have lost hope of there being any enduring meaning. The French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre said that without an infinite reference point, nothing finite has any lasting or enduring meaning. And that's kind of axiomatic, because if there isn't a lasting personal existence, then when we die, that's the end of anything that could be meaningful. But if there is a personal agent who created the universe, and that agent wants to know us, then that puts the whole question of personal meaning and ultimate meaning back on the table. And I think that the case for God from contemporary science is something that gives hope, because it shows that there's evidence for belief in such a being. That makes, I think, it opens up the possibility of a deeper spiritual investigation. It doesn't answer all of the questions, and certainly as a Christian, I believe that it sets the table for that deeper investigation. It's a form of general revelation through nature that renders more credible the idea that the scriptural revelation is what it claims to be, which is a communication of God to man in a more specific way. But that's maybe a topic for an additional conversation.
It's brilliant, and I hope we get a chance to do that down the road. But this has been a long-awaited conversation, Steve, and I think it's going to help people. Can't recommend your books highly enough, and I know that our conversation is going to inspire and give some hope to folks. I greatly appreciate your time and the beautiful work that you're doing at Discovery. How can people find out more about you?
I think perhaps the best entree is the website for the new book, Return of the God Hypothesis. I have a website for the other two books as well, and discovery.org is the website for our whole institute. From there, you can navigate to our program, the Center for Science and Culture, and find not only my work, but the work of all of our superstars, William Dembski and Michael Behe, Douglas Axe. I could go on. We got some great scientists who've done all kinds of fantastic work. A great way to, just an entree into this would be to go to returntothegodhypothesis.com. And from there there's a playlist of debates that I've done, a playlist of animations of the interior of the cell, and articles and animations and all kinds of cool stuff. So it's a great way, if you're interested in this topic of how God and science relate in a mutually harmonious and reinforcing way. That's a very good website to start. Our wizards tech guys at the Institute built a beautiful website. And
they did. We'll put all the links in the show notes. Stephen Meyer, thank you so much for your time. God bless you and your work and your family.
Thank you, Doc. And I know what we should have a time to talk about your work in neuroscience, because that's another huge challenge to this materialistic worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, great. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. What a great conversation. I'm so thankful that Dr. Meyer took the time to be with us today. He is highly in demand all over the world. It took 2 years to get him on our schedule. And as you heard, we couldn't possibly cover all the ground that we needed to cover. And we're going to have another conversation, Lord willing, down the road about neuroscience and the mind and the brain and all the things that are very familiar to you from listening to this podcast all the time. But I'm so thankful that we're able to bring guests like this to you. And that's a good reason for you should consider becoming a paid subscriber to the newsletter. If you read my work every Sunday, my prescription for how you can change your mind and change your life from neuroscience and faith on the Self-Brain Surgery Substack letter, drleewarren.substack.com. If you read that and you find it valuable, consider becoming a paid subscriber, because that's how we can afford to do this podcast and buy all the gear and employ the people that we need to employ and do the editing and all the work and go out and find these great guests and all that. Consider supporting the work by becoming a paid subscriber. It doesn't cost very much. Just a few cents a day, and it will help us spread this word of getting science and faith brought together, smashed together in a way that can unlock that power for your life to find the meaning and the purpose and help you overcome trauma and tragedy and all kinds of different things that happen in our lives. Listen, science is not the enemy of faith, and faith is not the enemy of science. They're designed to work together so you can understand how you're designed to flourish and how you can overcome just about anything that you can go through. Stephen Meyer helped us see it in a new light today. I hope it was helpful. I can't encourage you highly enough. If you want to really learn some deep stuff about how science and faith work together, you should check out Signature in the Cell if you want to know about the information that's present in DNA that helps DNA do its job and create somebody like you and me. And Darwin's Doubt if you want to understand the real questions behind why it's a not so fast thing. When you hear somebody say, hey, Darwin explains how life got here, not so fast, because there's some doubt about that. And molecular biology since the 50s has made it very clear, and the fossil record has made it very clear that the Darwinians don't have the final word here. So Darwin's Doubt by Stephen Meyer would be a very great book for you to check out if you're interested in that. And if you want to know how the history of science and faith are not in fact enemies, but have been friends all along, and in fact how there would be no real academic science if it weren't for Christianity, that book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, that landed Stephen on Joe Rogan's show, and he did a 3-hour interview where he, without any notes, defended the faith and science smashing together in the most beautiful way I've ever seen. Check that out. I'll put the link in the show notes. And The Return of the God Hypothesis is a great read. I hope and pray that we get to do this again. I hope it's been helpful to you. Remember, friend, like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, you can't change your life until you change your mind. And the very good news is you can start today. I'm Dr. Lee Warren. I'll see you back next week for some more self-brain surgery. God bless you, friend.